Hello, I'm Emma Osmondson, Managing Director of Exeter City Living. I have 14 years of passive house experience, and this afternoon I'm going to try and share some of that with you. So, today I'm going to tell you about Exeter's passive house journey, how this sits in context to the uptake of passive house in the UK, and what we've learnt over the last decade or so. Going to pick up on what the future holds for passive house in the UK as well. Now, Exeter was an early pioneer of the passive house standard in the UK, and our first development was completed in 2009. And for the first decade, Exeter's passive house portfolio was limited to social housing, providing council homes to add to the City Council's existing portfolio of 5,000 homes. Over the years, Exeter has led the uptake of passive house in the public sector, completing nearly 200 affordable homes in its first decade, and influencing many other public sector bodies to adopt the standard. Exeter has now moved to upscale its passive house ambitions by substantially increasing its current housing delivery pipeline and planning a sevenfold increase in delivery over the next decade. This growth in scale and ambition is testament to the confidence Exeter has gleaned, having been an early adopter of the passive house standard. And this is also reflected in the increased complexity of our passive house developments, with this year heralding the completion of the UK's first passive house leisure centre and extra care village. But Exeter started their passive house journey from relatively modest beginnings, with 3 flats designed in 2008. At that time, passive house was largely unheard of in the UK, so much so that I didn't tell the council that we were building passive house homes. Really, with the public sector being so inherently risk adverse, I felt it better to say nothing and seek forgiveness as opposed to permission. The principal driver for us adopting passive house at this time was our wish to eradicate fuel poverty. And given the inherent performance gap in new homes in the UK at the time, the passive house standard really did offer some security on achieving the performance of energy efficiency that we could only have dreamt of. And I'm pleased to say that the passive house standard did not disappoint. If anything, it excelled our expectations, and this encouraged us to quickly upscale our ambitions from 3 passive house homes to a further 18. Within 12 months, we were completing our second passive house development. This time, it turned out to be UK's first, in terms of the UK's first multi-residential development. Now, both Rowan House and Knights Place provided us with a test bed for things to come. We were also able to secure government funding for a 2-year post-completion monitoring study that helped inform our approach to future generations of passive house projects across the city. So from our first generation of passive house projects, we moved into our second generation of projects. These were predominantly family-sized homes, so we moved from delivering apartments to houses. The key driver for our second generation of passive house projects was cost. Our first generation of passive house had come with a 20% cost premium, and this was not sustainable for long-term delivery. We really needed to drive down costs, and we did this from our learnings from our earlier developments. And indeed, we were able to reduce our premium from 20% to less than 5%. And I guess Exeter's adoption and commitment to passive house led in many ways to the formation of its profit for purpose group of companies, the Exeter City Living Group. This was really born out of the city's ambitions to upscale passive house housing across the city and to really widen the passive house offer from just social housing to open market housing and commercial premises. The establishment of this group and Exeter City Living as its development delivery vehicle has really been a pivotal point in making passive house centre place in the council's development ambitions and the role that they play in leading passive house across the city. Exeter City Living was established to widen the tenure offer of Passive House to the open market. And this is for the first time giving customers choice in the type of home they can invest in. It is also serving as a catalyst to encourage other housing developers in the city to look with more focus on what they are building and to perhaps adopt the Passive House standard themselves, especially as the customer market is becoming alerted to the benefits of the Passive House standard. And of course, there's now growing evidence of the cost premium purchasers are prepared to pay for Passive House. This year has been a watershed for Exeter with the eagerly awaited completion of our Extra Care Village, another UK first. And this development formed part of a government-funded study on climate resilience during its early concept stages. And it was interesting to see just how well the Passive House approach proved in providing long-term climate resilience, particularly for accommodation that's specifically designed for a vulnerable occupancy group. Along with Edwards Court, this year sees the completion of our Passive House Leisure Centre. Again, another UK first, and this is really a very important Passive House project for the city, as this will be our first Passive House development that is accessible to the general public. It's a $64 million development, which will allow us to showcase Passive House and forms really the jewel in a wider regeneration plan for that part of the city. This building also incorporates building biology principles and is climate ready to at least 2080. This significant investment really is a testament of the confidence Exeter has gleaned in adopting the Passive House standard. 2020 is also a landmark for Exeter as it sees the commencement of our largest Passive House housing development to date, consisting of 92 homes at the Gardens, Whipton. This is not only the start of a programme of larger Passive House developments, but it's an important development in so much as it breaks through the cost premium barrier for Passive House. This development will be delivered 3% less in cost than conventional new build projects. The knowledge and experience that we've gained over the last decade in delivering Passive House has enabled us to really optimise the design, select the right construction methodology, and eradicate the many risks or concerns perceived by constructors. The development will also be the first market rent Passive House homes to be developed in Exeter, with 32 of the 92 homes being retained within the group structure as part of the Exeter City Homes portfolio. It is envisaged that this will again lead the way for higher standards in rental accommodation across the city. Clifton Hill is also a new Passive House development for Exeter, commencing this year, comprising of 31 large family homes and 11 affordable older persons apartments. This will be Exeter's first attempt in upscaling their market sale portfolio, and it will be exciting to see the sale premium that each will be reached. So watch this space to find out what that turns out to be. Looking ahead for Exeter, we have a healthy pipeline of exciting developments, and these will be brought forward as part of our livable Exeter vision. This is just a sneak preview of what to expect as we seek to deliver around about 1,500 new homes over the next coming decade. And I think this really shows that from relatively humble and modest beginnings, big Passive House ambitions can be realised. And I guess in many regards, the evolution of Passive House in the UK has been concurrent with the timeline of Exeter's Passive House journey. From the first certified Passive House homes completed in 2009 to the formation of the UK Passive House Trust in 2010, right the way through to the completion of the 1,000th certified home in 2018. Now, 2019 saw the Sterling Prize for Architecture being awarded to a Passive House development. It was a council house development at Goldsmith Street in Norwich. This prestigious architecture prize really put Passive House on the map within contemporary circles in the UK. And it really helped kind of rebut the critics who maligned Passive House for its perceived stereotypical architecture. Today in the UK, there's been nearly 1,400 completed certified Passive House buildings, with 5,000 new buildings under development and over 200 projects in the pipeline. Projects are spread across the entire United Kingdom. These projects have encompassed residential, new build, and retrofit. And we've also seen emerging Passive House master plans, which are evolving in Exeter, City of York, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. As well as a growth in residential Passive House projects, there's been an increasing growth in non-domestic Passive House developments, particularly in the education, archive, office, and leisure sectors. The scale of these Passive House projects is increasing, and I think this is really generating a high degree of interest, with clients really becoming a lot more ambitious on their aspirations to adopt the Passive House standard. So when we look to the future of Passive House, I would say it's looking rather bright. Slowly, we're seeing that the policy drivers are beginning to align with a Passive House direction of travel, although this does vary across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. In England, the government is consulting on a future home standard. While it falls short of the Passive House standard, it is a leap in the right direction. In Scotland, the government is linking its public funding to the Passive House standard for new schools. And in England, we're seeing the Department of Education trialling Passive House schools. The UK's Climate Change Committee and sixth carbon budget is likely to be the next major driver towards a more kind of fabric first approach to the built environment, as it tries to grapple with how best it can meet its zero carbon ambitions. But certainly in the last 2 years, we've seen a groundswell in industry initiatives. And these are more closely aligned to the adoption of Passive House as an industry standard. There have been a number of pioneer and exemplar projects over the years in Exeter, Norwich, and London. And these really have been the catalyst to inspire and upscale the industry. And we're now seeing larger scale Passive House developments being delivered and in the pipeline across the UK. Driven by government carbon targets, policy drivers and initiatives for retrofit, the adoption of the NFIT standard in the UK is picking up pace. Now, it's still early days as the industry grapples with the costs and complexities of really retrofitting a diverse stock of homes and buildings. There continues to be a number of exemplar and pioneer NFIT projects that over time are upscaling in scope and complexity. And the challenge really remains as to the industry's capability to upscale and the capacity really for them to implement the level of retrofit required in time to meet our carbon targets. The adoption of the Passive House standard differs for each country in the United Kingdom. Local authorities across the UK were without doubt early adopters, and there are moves for more local authority to set higher standards and Passive House to be adopted as part of their local planning policies. The declaration by 74% of local councils of a climate emergency has been a major catalyst in Passive House interest, particularly in the last 18 months. In Wales, there's been proactive government initiatives to promote the adoption of Passive House, including an innovative housing programme that funds Passive House developments. In Scotland, the pace of Passive House is at speed, with new standards proactively promoting a drive to Passive House as a default performance standard. So I've shared with you some of the sort of Passive House activities in Exeter over the last decade or so, and the UK more generally. So now I'd like to share with you the lessons we've learnt over this time, with the wrinkles to show for it. Today, I want to focus on some of the headlines, and I think it's probably best if we start by ensuring that the client is best informed. If Passive House is to be widely adopted, and at present the take up in the UK remains at 1% of all new buildings, we really need to ensure that clients know about Passive House in the first case and the reasons for adopting it. For many clients, the drivers for their developments or property purchases are entirely financially driven. It is therefore critically important that clients understand the business case for Passive House and that they understand the difference between cost and value. Many clients overlook the fact that their capital purchase has a direct correlation on the business costs and outcomes of their investment. Time and time again, we see clients push hard to reduce capital expenditure, only to be faced with disproportionate costs associated with maintenance, repairs, as well as operating their buildings as a consequence. And more so in the future when faced with the impacts of climate change and the decarbonisation of the electricity grid. Now, helping clients realise the added value of investing in a fabric-first approach and the increased marketability and value of their investment can be a compelling argument for answering the question, why not adopt the Passive House standard? In the UK, we know that Passive House commands at least a 10% sales premium. So even if there is a slight increase in construction cost for building Passive House, this is more than cushioned by the end value. What we are also seeing is increasing pressure from all investors to roll out environmental strategies and reduce their carbon impact. On average, 30% of shareholders in the major UK house builders have a focus on environmental, social, and governance issues, ESG. And this is often reflected in their voting decisions. Many shareholders are increasingly interested in building greener portfolios, heaping further pressure on house builders to operate more sustainably or face disinvestment. Just last month, BlackRock, the world's biggest investment manager, announced its Decarbonisation Partners Fund with Temasek. They will commit an initial $600 million to investment in low-carbon technologies, including in the built environment. For any project, whether it is Passive House or not, having the right project brief aligned to a realistic budget will determine whether or not a development is successful. The right project brief cannot be rushed, and often it will need to be tested to ensure that it aligns with the business plan for the client. Feasibility options may need to be explored before a brief is finalised. I would say that the project brief stage is a good point to get under the skin of what the client expectations are, particularly over the lifespan of the building or the asset, and really ensuring that the brief encapsulates the components for a future-proof building, perhaps beyond just the Passive House standard. Now, at Exeter, our brief stipulates that all our developments are not only certified Passive House, but healthy in accordance with the German building biology standard and climate ready to at least 2080. Setting the right budget for a Passive House project is also mission critical. For clients who are insistent on the wrong type of value engineering and cost reduction, it is prudent to remind them of the cost benefits of Passive House with regard to whole life cost savings and inbuilt climate resilience. Having the prospect of retrofitting a newly built asset before it's even been completed on site, due to the lack of foresight, is inexcusable based on the knowledge we now have on climate change and the planet's decarbonisation needs. Fixing the project brief so it's clear, concise, and ideally non-negotiable can be hard for some clients. Sticking to it and defending it as a client can be challenging too. Every development is not without its trials and tribulations, particularly given the turbulence of the of the current global economy. Clients will be pushed and pulled to loosen their project briefs when budgets and programs come under pressure. Believe me, we've been there and done that. Contractors will do their very best for certified passive house contract requirements to be dumbed down to perhaps passive house principles. I think we've all heard that. And for the performance criteria to be relaxed to supposedly offer up savings and for extra payments to be paid when contracts overrun. Sticking firm to the project brief and embedding it within both the contract terms and the terms and conditions of the whole project team will all help deliver passive house success. Having the right project team will go a long way in securing a successful passive house project. Passive house qualifications of your architect alone will not be enough. It's vital that you appoint a project team that are both qualified and experienced in passive house. This should apply to as many of the project team as possible, beyond just the architects and the design team, to encompass your cost consultants, your engineers, and the project delivery team, the project managers, the cost consultants, the QSs, and the like. Many a passive house project has not left the drawing board due to the inaccurate costings of a project QS. Now, where qualifications or experience are lacking, look for the right attitude and a willingness to learn. If need be, mix and match your team with experience and expertise. And where there are gaps, ensure team members are really empowered to speak up and seek assistance from other practitioners, particularly if they are lacking passive house experience. And finally, don't forget to appoint your passive house certifier early on. They can play a really important role in supporting your project team. I would say that employing a passive house qualified and experienced architect or designer will probably save you up to 60% of the cost premium for passive house by them understanding how best to optimize the design. Form factor, orientation, and construction methodology, if carefully selected, can determine whether a design goes into construction. Knowing your way around the passive house planning package, the PHPP, can give you greater freedom on material and specification choices. All of these can help towards the viability of your project. Passive house experience enables a designer to kind of normalize their design, and in doing so, de-risking it from a contractor's perspective, who often get scared off by anything that they consider to be experimental. Designing passive house buildings so that they are easily buildable is also important. Setting up a contractor to fail by complicating detailing, especially around air tightness strategy and at junctions, is just a recipe for disaster. At Exeter, we've had a lot of experience, so I can safely say that we've probably been there and done it with all passive house potential disasters. Getting the energy strategy sorted early on is also critical to avoid over-complex mechanical and electrical systems. And often it's the M&E that compromises the ease of buildability and operation. I always say that less is more when it comes to passive house. Now, if I had $1 for every question related to passive house based around cost, I would probably be supping pina coladas in the Caribbean and not with you today. People's perception of costs relating to passive house are flawed. This is because people have an inbuilt tendency to compare passive house with non-passive house. When they then try and benchmark passive house, they still often don't get the answer that they want. Benchmarking passive house is really tricky, as to date, many passive house projects have either been of a low volume or are being very specific, particularly in the UK. Many of them have been experimental, so each scheme has been more or less a one-off. Now, we're lucky in Exeter because many of our projects, whilst they have been singular, we've had plenty of opportunity to embed our learning and improvements and this has allowed us to introduce far greater efficiencies. Many projects, passive house projects, are for clients who want life cycle performance built in, and the projects are really built to a performance standard and not a budget. But what is important, though, is to understand what drives the passive house cost premium. And cost is influenced by key drivers, which must be focused on and optimized from the outset of the design development. The cost drivers can produce savings such as adopting a compact form, simpler systems and controls. Or the cost drivers can add costs due to the addition of, say, better quality components, air tightness, ventilation systems, and the need for greater care and attention to detail. And in Exeter, we have sought to drive down the cost of passive house year on year. As I said earlier, from a 20% premium to a 3% saving for our current multi-residential developments. And we've been able to do this by understanding what passive house projects cost. Even where a project commands a premium of, say, 3% for a detached family home, this typically equates to a $6,000 extra over cost. Now, this extra cost will be spread over a number of elements, including tapes and membranes, extra insulation, triple glazing, and the like. But over 50% of this extra overcost is in fact related to services, about 23%. And the additional costs associated with site supervision and quality assurance, 31%. So a third of the additional cost in reality is for something that we should not be paying a premium for at all, as surely quality assurance and site supervision is a given. There's no escaping the current reality, and until the passive house standard is more universal and the market becomes more competitive, there will be for many clients a passive house premium to pay. In these instances, it is important to be able to rationalise the premium, some of which will be financial and quantifiable, and some of which will be non-financial and non-quantifiable. We often refer to these premiums as below-line benefits, and they include such things as, for example, reduced rent arrears, where residents are paying negligible or no costs for heating, which means far greater affordability to pay rent, or lower void rates. We generally find that tenants do not want to move out of their passive house homes, even when they're given other options of perhaps newer homes elsewhere. There are life cycle cost benefits with reduced maintenance repair liabilities. And this very much is aligned with the kind of quality assurance benefits that come from kind of the contractors indirectly having to focus on more stringent and rigorous performance standards that come with passive house. And of course, you've got the eradication of fuel poverty and the direct health benefits for residents. Many successful passive house projects are largely down to selecting the right contractor and adopting the best sort of procurement routes to secure them. And generally speaking, the choice of procurement will be determined by the contractor market and the threshold for risk. If your passive house project is perceived to be risky, then you may need to adopt different forms of procurement, such as a partnering route or a two-stage tendering approach. And this may result in a longer leading period before site mobilisation. Your route to market may also need to be determined by the extent of contractor availability or their willingness to take on passive house projects or contractor experience in the marketplace. I know in Exeter, up until 18 months ago, there were many occasions when we had to pay contractors even to tender for our projects, and the level of interest was generally low. Now we have contractors scrambling to be on our tender list, not because the market isn't buoyant, when indeed it is booming, but contractors see passive house as the direction of travel, and they're keen to get the experience. Now, contractor experience is still evolving, and it will do as more and more projects become delivered. But like consultants, I often advocate selecting contractors based on experience and attitude. Some of our most successful projects have been with contractors who've had little or no passive house experience, but they have the right attitude to qualify to deliver really high quality construction, and they also have a collaborative working ethic. We often appraise our contractors on a quality cost ratio of 60/40. Impressing on contractors that they are an integral part of the project delivery team and treated accordingly really does help to instill greater collaborative and a can-do culture that goes a long way to Passive House project success. Adopting a no-blame culture on site and rewarding subcontractors or workers and trades to call out mistakes or problems early on ensures that things really don't get covered up and high quality is maintained. And this really is a cornerstone for successful Passive House project delivery. Some of the key elements for successful construction and delivery are ensuring that the construction programme is realistic. Help contractors who are new to Passive House to understand the components that they need to be included in their programme at tendering stage. This includes allowing for an adequate mobilisation period. No one benefits if the contractor's cash runs out partway through the contract. Help contractors by ensuring your design is buildable with simple and clear detailing. Design out any potential problems for site fabrication errors or designs that just don't work on site. Watch out, because inexperienced passive house designers do have a habit of copying details from other Passive House projects, which are not transferable or replicable on other projects. It's important to provide budget provision for supermodels. No, not that type of supermodel you may be thinking of, but full-size cross-section models of key junction and fabric makeup sections. So contractors can really test the construction techniques and really see how the components of Passive House are put together. We always look to provide for as much on-site assistance as possible. At Exeter, we employ a client-side Passive House qualified clerk of works. They report to us, but they really do provide on-site help, and they're an extra pair of eyes for the contractor. We also employ on our larger projects a Passive House technical assurance team, who again report to us as client, but provide feedback to the contractor and their technical teams on anything that they feel is lacking or falling short of expectations. We generally encourage contractors to provide regular toolbox talks and on-site training for all their subcontractors and site staff on a regular basis. And on some of our large projects, the main contractor operates a hard hat identification scheme where workers are identified by the level of Passive House training they have received. Finally, integrating a soft landing approach during the final stages of your Passive House project can help get your project over the line and fit for certification. Now, depending on the complexity of your project, this can include creating test areas for defining the quality thresholds to be met, staggering the commissioning and handover process, could be trial open days and installing monitoring equipment within the fabric to assist with fine-tuning during the post-completion optimization period. We know, for example, in Germany, where there are 2 Passive House leisure centres, the energy efficiencies of these facilities have increased year on year during the first years of operation as the M&E systems were optimised. I personally consider Passive House to be one of the most undersold commodities in the marketplace. And I really think we need to extol the virtues of the Passive House brand and inform the market in a way that Passive House is so much more than an energy standard. To be frank, Passive House needs to be sexed up. We need to be shouting about the many benefits of Passive House, be it comfort, an enhancement to health and well-being, low carbon, high performance, climate resilience, value for money, and the list goes on. And we need to adapt our sales approach for Passive House to allow people to experience and understand what Passive House means. We already have evidence to prove that Passive House can attract a sales premium. And that's without sexing up the brand. But we do need to do more to inform clients and potential purchasers and, I guess, investors of the market for the potential premium that comes with investing in Passive House. And to aid with this, we need to share our Passive House performance data and our business case data so more people can share the magic of Passive House. Finally, my last tip from all that I've learned to date about Passive House is to share the love. Winston Churchill once said, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." Over the last decade or so, I have learned from the generosity of so many, particularly the global Passive House family. The more we can share, warts and all, the wider we can open our doors to our Passive House projects, and the more we will learn and the smarter we will get, in theory. This year's conference is all about Passive House for everyone. Together, by sharing the love of Passive House, we can create a future where there can be a Passive House for everyone. Thank you.
We have a couple of questions that came in on the chat that I want to go through, but also want to open it up to the audience, the live audience. We're going to go off script a little bit. So if anyone in the audience has a question, I know there's some technical difficulty, you can ask it. I'll repeat it for the Zoom audience, and we can carry on from there. So one of the things that came up, Emma, while you were presenting, was the level of local infrastructure that existed kind of early on in your design work. So we're thinking mostly about trades and getting them on board. Were there formalized Passive House trades training, or was this really something that was done on site early on and taught through the design process?
Oh, I think what I would say was originally the training was kind of almost self-taught. Over the years, obviously, there's been a lot more training opportunities through more formalized Passive House trades, people training courses, and there's certainly more on the uptake in the UK. But originally, we had to ensure that we very much simplified our designs to make them extremely buildable, so that when we then appointed the contractors and they then appointed their subcontractors, we could easily disseminate the design into practical buildable experience. So we were kind of demystifying Passive House and got people just to focus on the quality of build, which then just had the consequence of delivering a much higher energy performance standard.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I guess a follow-up would be, you mentioned a little bit of hand-holding throughout the process. So how much do you typically experience that, especially with a new contractor? And are you billing for that as something that's just part of the general scope? How do you navigate that?
Okay, well, I think, as everyone will know, in the Passive House world, there's immense generosity. And I always believe the more that you give, the more you get back. So certainly when you've got new contractors that perhaps have got zero Passive House experience, you will probably invest more time and energy. Your project team will probably invest a little bit more time in terms of their direct on-site practitioner help that they give to the subcontractors and the trades. We probably will give a much more detailed drawings. We would not normally take drawings to a very detailed constructional stage on some projects which were non-Passive House, but certainly for Passive House, we'd probably do very detailed drawings. So all we're trying to do is skill up and provide the tools that make it easier for contractors. And then what we find now, we're on our sort of 6th and 7th generation, certainly of Passive House homes. Most contractors are familiar with the details. So by keeping a degree of consistency, so we're not going from one prototype design to another, by actually adopting some standard working details, that means that they're getting integrated much quicker and they're just easier to construct, and therefore we're de-risking it from the contractor, and as a consequence of that, we're driving down costs.
Yeah, I love the idea of replicability. I think that's really a theme that I've seen throughout these projects. here in North America, it really is where the rubber hits the road when we get the trades involved. So thank you for addressing that. That's really important part of this whole process. I found it interesting, this what you call the hard hat program. I was just curious if you could speak to that. And was that your idea? Or was that something that the contractors developed on site on their own?
Yeah, so this was this was probably more of a site initiative that was developed for by the main contractor for our leisure centre project. So we've got two really key performance criteria on that project. We want the building to be certified passive house. So we've got to upskill all the subcontractors in what that means. And at the same time, we've got a building biology compliant building. So that means we're using different materials than perhaps most contractors are used to. So one of the innovative ways that the contractor overcame any risks associated with people not being fully briefed on both those standards was having a color-coded hat identification system. So depending on the stage of build of the project, people would have to go through prescriptive passive house training. And one of the easiest way to identify that was by having color-coded hard hats. So it meant that only certain people had access to certain phases of the building, so that there was a clear identification and confidence that the right people were in the right places and kind of working at the key stages that didn't in any way compromise any of the detailing that would then perhaps interfere with certification further down the line.
Wow, that's really brilliant. I think we should look into adopting that here. I wonder how that hierarchy would play out on a New York construction site, but it'd be interesting to see. Moving away from the trade side, going more towards the client side, we had a couple questions in the chat kind of in the same topic. So in those early conversations when talking to clients, what was really the argument or the points that you made to go passive in the first pace? And did you take the upfront costs and really explain out what the benefits are going to be early on? Or as you mentioned initially, you didn't even talk about passive house early on. So what strategy did you use in that way?
Yeah, so I suppose from very early on, because passive house was unfamiliar, this is 14 years ago, when you start kind of talking about things that people aren't comfortable with or don't know about, they quickly switch off and quite often will not necessarily adopt your approach. So originally, I kind of sold passive house to our city council through it being purely a tool to eradicate fuel poverty. So I said, look, we're going to develop the best social homes that we possibly can that will guarantee that fuel poverty will be eradicated. So I kind of transferred the passive house kind of definition into something that was very human focused. And from a social housing perspective, that really worked. Now, for a lot of clients, obviously they've got other drivers. Often they are financially driven or economically driven. And therefore, I think it's really important that people understand the business case for passive house. And I think often the business case for passive house gets lost with kind of all the green credentials or the low carbon or zero carbon credentials of the standard. But I think ultimately most clients listen hardest when you start talking about figures, facts, figures and numbers. And so often you'll hear me speaking a lot about the business benefits of passive house, and those will be above line in terms of the direct savings to a client in terms of life cycle cost benefits, benefits in terms of increased marketability, increased profitability if you're looking at it from a developer's perspective. But I'll also equally talk in detail about what I call the below line benefits. So some of the more social and environmental aspects. And I think when you start combining those and really educate clients in terms of what value means as opposed to cost or price, then you have a much more compelling argument. And well, actually, you don't have an argument at all. The case is relatively straightforward, and the facts and figures speak for themselves.
Yeah, and I guess following up on that, the figures part of this, are you logging these projects in terms of energy consumption, air quality, and if so, are you sharing that with clients? Is this one of the selling points that you're using?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we have been fortunate with some government funded studies, certainly for post monitoring work. So we've been able to take, we have monitoring equipment that's taking energy readings, taking carbon dioxide readings to give us a good reflection of air quality and the like. We have temperature sensors, and that's been really powerful tool for giving people the confidence that the standard really works and delivers. B, giving us really credible evidence in terms of our business modeling, in terms of the figures that we're using, financial figures that we're utilizing. And when we do kind of more of the qualitative research in terms of one-to-one interviews and questionnaires, we're getting really good quality feedback in terms of some of the indirect health benefits, certainly the benefits with regard to people's comfort levels, and then we're seeing direct benefits in regard to the savings that we're making in terms of housing management, and kind of the revenue value that we're getting from actually managing an asset base that is of a passive house standard.
Yeah, great. I guess I want to put you on the hot seat a little bit. Is this data available publicly? Can you share it with us on the other side of the pond here?
Of course. Always happy to share the love. So yeah, we can. I can certainly get that available and to share with all my friends across the pond.
Great.
I give it to
That would be
Biden.
amazing.
I'll give it to Biden. He can bring it back from Cornwall.
Perfect. Yeah, he's there now, right? So that's good timing on all this. Well, I just want to thank you again. Really amazing work. I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. I'll do a quick scan. Looks like we're good. So any closing remarks? Again, really, really inspiring work.
Well, thank you very much. And let everyone keep sharing the love. You know, Passive House is an incredible standard. And, you know, your conference is about Passive House for everyone. And I think what we've clearly demonstrated in Exeter is that we can drive down cost, we can make this accessible, and we can make this deliverable for everyone. So just go for it.
Awesome. Thank you.